We'll have much more on the significance of this polling in just a moment. We also learned yesterday that the Trump administration will not cooperate with the inquiry, calling it illegitimate and unconstitutional. We've got the first sign of that when the State Department blocked EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland, a key witness in the probe, from testifying before Congress. Democrats responded to that by issuing a subpoena to compel his testimony and for documents related to the president's efforts to get Ukrainian officials to investigate Joe Biden and his son. And remember the text message that diplomat Bill Taylor sent Sondland that said it was, quote, crazy to withhold military aid to Ukraine to help the president's campaign? A source now tells NBC News that before responding hours later, quote, no quid pro quo, Sondland actually called and consulted with the president. There's also new reporting related to the president's call with the president of Ukraine. According to the New York Times, one day after that call, the whistleblower wrote a memo about a White House official who was, quote, visibly shaken after listening to the conversation. And citing two sources, CNN is reporting that the president's demand for Energy Secretary Rick Perry and two other top State Department officials to work with Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine dates back to at least May. And then there's this. Despite the president's quest to prove that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election to help Hillary Clinton, the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee released a bipartisan report yesterday that affirms the assessment from the intelligence community that Russia used a vast social media campaign to help Trump win the election. Joe, a lot to unpack here before we even get to the White House response to the impeachment inquiry.
Why don't we start with that last item? You know, John Meacham, Republicans and defenders, people who will blindly defend Donald Trump regardless, always seize on the Mueller report and say there was no collusion, there was a Russian witch hunt, it's a witch hunt, it was a hoax, and breeze past all of the troubling findings in there. We still have a president who is still chasing down conspiracy theories across the world with his attorney general instead of worrying about what's going on at home, trying to prove that the Russians, in fact, were not at the center of it, that it was Ukraine or somebody else. CrowdStrike. Here we have the Republican-led Intel Committee in the Senate saying, for history, as a matter of fact, that the Russians actually did influence our 2016 election. They tried to influence it, at least, for the sake of Donald Trump. They are now lined up with the FBI, the CIA, the NSA. Every federal agency now agrees on the same thing, along with the Senate Intel Committee, that the Russians tried to influence the election to help elect Donald Trump. The only person in Washington, apparently, who still doesn't believe this is Donald Trump.
Right. Well, he says he doesn't believe it. And I suspect what we're going to see here is a revivification, if you will, a renewal of the outrage, of the concern, of the fact that our national security has been at risk here. And we don't have to be hysterical about it. This doesn't have to be a partisan issue. That's the critical thing here. These are pretty cold facts, stone cold, to use one of the president's favorite locutions. And I go back to that crazy liberal Dick Cheney, who said that if, in fact, Russia tried to tamper with the elections, influence the elections, it was an act of war. Well, here we have it. And I think that also puts the entire story in a context that, again, no matter where you stand on the ideological spectrum, be driven by the facts. And as you say, here's a Republican-led committee saying what seems to be obvious. And that's the context in which we're dealing here. We have been under attack from a foreign power that wants to sow chaos. And they've done it. Here we are.
Well, and, you know, David Ignatius, I think at this point we just need to go down the list again because it is so damning to the president and Mitch McConnell, both of whom continue to try to block all efforts to put up the type of security that we need to prevent Russia from interfering in 2020. But you have Trump's director of the FBI, Trump's appointed director of the CIA, Trump's past director, past NDI. You had Trump's the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, all saying directly that this was an imminent threat to American democracy. You even had Trump's acting NDI go to the Hill last week and saying far more than a thermonuclear blast from North Korea or another country, the gravest threat to America was Russia interfering in our elections. You now have the Republican-led Senate Intel Committee drawing this same conclusion. And again, not only Donald Trump, but Mitch McConnell doing absolutely nothing to protect us in 2020 from a similar attack that all of these agencies say is the greatest threat to American democracy.
Joe, I think the importance of this bipartisan Senate report is that it undermines the narrative that Donald Trump's Attorney General William Barr, even now, is trying to construct about some kind of deep state plot to do in the president, to campaign against him, to reverse his election. That's what Barr has been traveling around Europe trying to gather evidence to support. And here is the Senate Intelligence Committee, led by a Republican, which says, no, whatever Barr turns up is irrelevant to the facts that we have gathered that show Russian attempts to interfere in our election, to support Trump, to hinder Hillary Clinton. I think that's the key. It's one more voice, but it's a particularly important one. But we'll hear a lot more about that counter narrative. That's just beginning to crest. And there are a lot of people out there who support Donald Trump who believe it. So it's really important to have this bipartisan counter evidence come out now.
And as they might say in Congress, just a point of personal privilege here. I came into Congress in 1994 with a lot of people who were conservative firebrands, who said they were going to fight for the conservative cause. I've seen so many of them fall by the wayside, so many of them act in ways that have disappointed not only me, but real conservatives. I got to say, I came in with Richard Burr, and I did not expect, all these years later, 20 years later, that he would be the one who was really one of the most steadfast advocates, one of the straightest shooters for the rule of law, for truth, for protecting the country. I always liked him, but he wasn't a firebrand. He just quietly sat back and did his job. And I'll be darned if he's not the guy out of all of those that I came in with who right now is putting his country above his party. It's a very rare thing, sadly, in Washington, D.C. these days, but that's what he's doing.
Joe, you said that exactly right.
Chuck,
he has got the back of his ranking member, Mark Warner, and Mark Warner has Richard Burr's back. And that's the way it's supposed to work.
That's the way Washington's supposed to work, and that's the way it does work when Americans' leaders are actually doing the right thing and are more interested in helping America move forward than their own political careers. So Chuck Rosenberg, we talked about early on about the Trump White House basically declaring war on this impeachment inquiry. Let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. During the Mueller investigation, time and again, I was concerned about a constitutional crisis if Donald Trump fired Mueller, if there was like a Saturday night massacre, or if a judicial ruling came down and the Trump administration refused to follow that judicial ruling. That would have been a constitutional crisis. This is more of a political battle, a pitched, heated political battle, but not exactly a constitutional crisis. So that being said, what are some of the this isn't Nixon defying the Supreme Court. If he had defied the Supreme Court, these are two branches of government fighting each other. So is there a legal remedy? Can these committee chairmen and chairwomen go to the courts and have testimony compelled?
Theoretically, yes, Joe. Practically, it's going to take a very long time, and that's the problem. You know this from having served as a member. Typically, this is done through accommodation. But here, the White House has signaled very clearly that they don't want to accommodate anyone or anything. One thing that I think we should take from this, some context, if you will, because I was a prosecutor for a long time, lots and lots of times, people that we investigate, subjects or targets, don't cooperate with us. They destroy documents, they withhold evidence, they lie, or they counsel others to lie. And nevertheless, we're able to prosecute our cases. In fact, if you want a real-life example of that, look at Volume 2 of the Mueller report, where the White House obstructed the investigation for months on end, and the Mueller team was still able to detail what happened. And why can they do that? Because there are other places to go to get information. Right now, we're seeing that. Even with the Ukraine matter, there's lots of information out there from other sources, from text messages, from recollections, right, from testimony, that that investigators will get even without the White House's cooperation. So deeply unfortunate, not terribly surprising, but it doesn't mean that the investigation comes to a dead halt.
Yeah, and you know, Willie, it's not like the White House, the executive branch is holding all the cards. The House has the power of the purse. They have the checkbook. They can creatively figure out ways to squeeze the White House, to squeeze Donald Trump. At least to get, we did that time and again where we squeezed our White House, and at the very, at least you get people sitting down at the table and figure out, all right, how do we break this impasse?
Yeah, because when you get to the point where the House is issuing subpoenas and the White House is now saying explicitly in a letter sent to the House, we're not going to comply with any of that, what do you do? And you just offered one solution to it, but it's kind of a moment, Mike, where both sides are going to sit there and stare at each other in a standoff. It's rare you see this in this letter that the White House sent over to the House. Just an explicit statement that we're going to obstruct your investigation.
No. Yeah.
We put it down in writing. It's sort of it's a political defense written in Trump language masquerading as a legal document.
Well, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. I was reading it last night, 8 pages from the White House counsel, and 1/3 of it is legalese, as it ought to be, and 2/3 of it is basically a political track.
Right.
But it's almost the news out of it, and I realize that most schools, most high schools, grammar schools in this country no longer teach civics. But this letter and the behavior of the Trump administration is basically an announcement that there is only one branch of government, the executive branch of government. And Chuck, to that point, the executive branch of government, and this was referenced by David Ignatius a couple of minutes ago, the continuing role of the Attorney General of the United States in all of this, Bill Barr, from the get-go, from his preemptive announcement about what was in the Mueller report, what was not in the Mueller report, skewing people's perceptions of that report, to his latest venture overseas with John Durham, who has been assigned as an independent investigator, and he has the Attorney General apparently looking over his shoulder as the Attorney General tries to concoct some alternative theory to what happened in 2016. You're a veteran prosecutor, you're a veteran of the Justice Department, you're a veteran of the FBI. What's your reaction to him?
You know, I had said for months, Mike, that I thought Barr was a principled institutionalist. And then I said, I think on this show, I was flat out wrong. I had it wrong. I've been deeply disappointed by what I've seen. And that first thing that really sort of shook me was Mr. Barr's mischaracterization of Bob Mueller's work. Yeah. And as you know, and as you've said, right, once that lie is out there, it's really hard for the truth to catch up. And we saw that with the Mueller report. People still don't understand what Bob Mueller found, and that's deeply disappointing. All that said, I also have confidence in John Durham. I know John, I trust John, I like John, and I respect John. What I'm worried about is not John or his findings or his work. What I'm worried about, as with the Mueller report, is the tendency for this Attorney General to mischaracterize that work. And that's the danger. It's not what John is doing or what John might find. It's how John's work might be spun. And that's what's so disappointing to me, Mike.
You know, John Meacham, I have been boringly predictable, talking time and again how Washington's institutions, America's institutions, would check the worst autocratic instincts of Donald Trump. I must say, I've learned an awful lot over the past several years, and one of the things I've learned is that the position of Attorney General is particularly susceptible to corruption, and not having that straight shooter. You look at the Attorney General Barr, who I believe is every bit as grave of a threat to our constitutional norms as Donald Trump. And let's just, what Chuck just said, I mean, here's a guy that lied about the Mueller investigation and the findings. He actually went and testified and lied and threw out a conspiracy theory that had long been debunked on what the basis of the Mueller investigation was. Even though he knew it was a lie, he's going around the globe right now chasing conspiracy theories that he knows is a lie because he's not representing the people. He is Donald Trump's Roy Cohn. And now, of course, you have Congress defying, or you have Donald Trump defying Congress, the White House, and having contempt for their traditional oversight responsibilities. And I just wonder, how does this stack up to Watergate in 1974? How does Barr stack up to John Mitchell? Because suddenly, John Mitchell doesn't seem like the worst attorney general in U.S. history. He seems like he's probably going to come in second.
Well, you know, in American legal history, you can either be John Marshall or John Mitchell. And I think Bill Barr has chosen his fate here. And so, you know, Mitchell was longtime friend, insofar as Nixon had friends, had been his law partner, and municipal bond lawyer, had left the Justice Department to run the Committee to Re-elect the President. The Committee to Re-elect the President, which, again, in this context, looks like a fairly sedate operation. Was because at least it was, you know, domestic. You know, they didn't hire Russian burglars. I guess if they'd outsourced, that would make it worse. Mitchell was an architect of the cover-up, and was a former attorney general at that point. But the point remains, what General Barr has done is treated the president and his political capacity as his primary client, as opposed to the interests of justice of the United States. And that's the decision he made. He'll answer for it at in the long sweep of history. And I think where we are in terms of the historical comparison with Watergate is very close. We're heading toward a U.S. v. Trump Supreme Court case. We've had all the language from Watergate, stonewalling, modified, limited, hangout, twist slowly in the wind. That whole vernacular is entirely applicable here. The one thing that's a little different is that we're moving even more rapidly. That is, the speed is quicker. The rate of speed is quicker. And I think don't underestimate, or as George W. Bush would say, let's not misunderestimate those polls, that 58, that 53. We haven't gotten 58% of the people to agree to go to Burger King in a long time in this country. 58% is a big number, if that's a solid number. And as Willie was saying, this is the Edmund Burke moment for members of Congress, right? They have a choice. They either reflect the will of their constituents, or they exercise their judgment. And the 58%, or let's call it 55%, that enables them to do a little bit of both.
You know, Willie Geist, I've got to say, there's a reason we pay John Meacham the big bucks. You just had a beautiful, eloquent dissertation on John Marshall.
Yeah.
Edmund Burke, and Burger King.
And Burger King.
Okay.
Punctuated with Burger King.
Big 3N.
Right.
By the way, Willie, you and I, we are the 58% that say let's all go to Burger King.
Amen,
Okay.
brother. Amen.
Yeah, or what's the one that does
What
the
could be
Whopper?
better?
Is that Burger
That's
King?
Burger King.
Yeah.
All right.
Whopper, man.
Delicious.
Welcome to
I
America,
love the
Mika. This is your country.
Okay.
How does he not know what a Whopper is? Good
Never
Lord.
had one.
You've
Okay.
never had a
They're
Whopper?
They're charcoal broiled. Come on.
Special
Why-
orders don't
Jeez.
upset us.
All right, still ahead on Morning Joe.
No.
Am I being mocked for not getting
McDonald's.
closer?
Hold the pickle, hold the lettuce.
All right, I can
Oh,
end
that
this,
is.
Alex
Yes, have
says.
it your
Okay,
way.
we'll end it now.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.